Today we're going to learn about lactose intolerance. I would bet that most of you guys, well, some of you guys watching this video and listening are lactose intolerant. A fair amount of the world is. So let's learn about it, especially those of you who cannot tolerate dairy. I think I'll provide some really interesting material to help you understand why your stomach hates you when you consume dairy products. So let's get into it. In order to understand lactose intolerance, we have to define lactose. So what is lactose? Well, lactose, number one here, is a disaccharide. Di meaning two, it is a structure that is composed of two sugars. One of the sugars is galactose, which many of us might not have heard of, but most of us have heard of glucose. And both of these, through some chemistry, come together to make lactose by way of this little connection here. It's a relatively simple sugar and it's present in dairy. It's about up to 8% by weight in milk. It's present in all dairy products in different amounts. But this is a sugar that's not well tolerated in some of you guys. I'm not lactose intolerant, but I know a fair amount of people who are. One really interesting fact is that lactose is actually used in pharmaceutical products. Crystalline lactose is used in tablets. It has this property that makes it really easy to compress. So drugs like oxycodone, Xanax, tramadol, clonopin, and other drugs in tablet form actually have a little lactose in there to help that tablet compress in the shape that it needs to be. Let's get into what it means to be lactose intolerant. Intolerant means, you can't, in this case, you can't break this thing down, and lactose, we understand, is a disaccharide. It's a sugar found in dairy. The main culprit for this is what's called a lactase deficiency. Another word for lactase is beta-galactosidase. It's a complicated word. This is what the enzyme looks like. It's actually a pretty crazy thing right here. This is kind of like a 3D computer model, but it's a pretty complicated enzyme. So what it does is that when you consume dairy, that lactose runs through your stomach and it hits your intestine, your small intestine. And lactase will it'll break down that lactose into galactose and glucose. The issue here is that you have a deficiency. You have a very low amount of lactase, and lactose will build up. Lactose is processed in the small intestine, specifically in this place called the brush border, and lactase is located here. And we're going to talk in the next slide about what this is, this brush border. It's important to know that the absorption of nutrients takes place oftentimes really in a large amount in your small intestine. That is a part of your GI system where all the action takes place and it gets into your bloodstream. It's a very absorbent part of your body. What's also interesting is that there are different types of lactose intolerance. You have primary, secondary, congenital, and developmental, and we'll cover that in this video. In the last slide, I mentioned this small intestine brush border. So let's come on in here. So you got your esophagus where you swallow, that food comes in there, gets processed by the stomach, and then it moves through this small intestine, this really long winding tube of tissue. And in that tube, you got, the tube inside, the lumen, and all this stuff that surrounds it. And then if we zoom in here, you have this really, I don't even know what to describe it, really odd looking structure with these little pieces that kind of stick out. And if you zoom into these little pieces, you have these cells, these microvilli. And then you have this structure on these cells called the brush border. Essentially, let me change my thing here. You have these structures that, it's hard to describe, they kind of sit on this brush border. They're all different types of structures. One of these structures is lactase, this enzyme. Lactose will come in here, attach, the enzyme does its thing, and then it's broken down into glucose and galactose. So this is kind of where the action takes place. There's a lot going on in the small intestine, but this is kind of where the issue is when it comes to a lactase deficiency. So let's dive a little deeper in this situation we have going on. I mentioned that lactose intolerance is really a lactase deficiency, and there are different types of lactase deficiencies, different kinds of lactose intolerance. Number one here is primary. Primary is what's called lactase non-persistence, as in the lactase doesn't really persist in your body. This is the most common. Most people have lactase non-persistence or primary lactose intolerance. When you're born, the lactase immediately starts to decrease from birth. So you show signs of lactose intolerance in adulthood and adolescence. So I got my little graph here. Essentially, you think about your lactase starting here, and then it just dips and dips and dips and dips. This is just a general age, but as you can see from the jump, your lactase goes down, and that's when you start to feel those symptoms. Then we have secondary lactose intolerance. Now this is a little less common. These next three are less common. When you have an injury to your intestinal mucosa, this tissue in your intestine, it's caused by some kind of disease. So celiac disease, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. I don't have time to get into these. You can Google them. These are all different types of intestinal conditions that could affect the lactase that your body has. Then we have congenital. So congenital is caused by a genetic defect from birth. Anything called congenital means from birth there's a defect. And this is genetic, from an autosomal inheritance. Essentially, you inherit this from a parent, and they have this gene that essentially doesn't let you process lactose. Your lactase is deficient. Then we have developmental. Developmental is mainly in premature babies, the preemies, 27 to 38 weeks gestation. And the issue here is that when you're premature, a lot of your organs aren't fully developed. In this case, your intestines are underdeveloped. So you develop a lactase deficiency, but as you age and your intestines develop, it does get better. And this is a lot less common. So let's get into the signs and symptoms. So number one, when you don't have enough lactase and your body comes in contact with lactose in that brush border, the lactose will build up in your intestines. This will draw fluid and build up into that lumen, that space. And what happens is that when you process your food and it moves through your intestine, as it moves through the intestine, water gets slowly drawn out. In this case, there's excess water, which results in diarrhea. So this is where the diarrhea comes from, that buildup of fluid in your intestine. We have good bacteria, this gut flora is what it's called, that really helps us digest and it really keeps us alive, essentially. The bacteria in your GI system is very, very important. So when you have lactose that builds up, well, these bacteria are going to do their job. They're going to break that down. They're going to ferment that lactose, this special process. Got a little bacteria right here. And it produces gas, which is why you have a lot of gas and a lot of stomach pain. Hydrogen gas, carbon dioxide, methane gas, etc. This is just a product of that fermentation, which explains those symptoms. Then number three, all of this contributes to the symptoms you have, from diarrhea to stomach pain, cramping, nausea, bloating. It's just a result of these and some other situations that cause these very undesired symptoms when you consume dairy products. Let's briefly talk about lactate or lactose-free products. I'm going to post, I think, a pretty good paper on lactose intolerance. It's very easy to read and understand. There's no technical jargon. This is really where I got a lot of my information from. And if you want to read it, it provides more detailed stuff that I'm not going to cover in this video. So the goal here is to produce lactase. And this enzyme is developed from bacteria. We use this natural process the bacteria have to develop lactase. I'm not lactose intolerant, like I said, but I understand that if you take the pills, you usually take it with food right before dairy is consumed. And this pill has lactase, so it digests that lactose for you. It aids in the process because you don't have enough lactase to deal with the lactose. Then we have lactose-free dairy products. Again, these have lactase in them, but because of that, the dairy is lacking lactose. So what you have is you have glucose and galactose present, already broken up, which means that you might notice it's slightly sweeter. It's because those sugars are broken up and you taste them more. You don't taste them as much at all when you're drinking like whole milk. Whole milk does have a sweetness to it, but it's a little sweeter if you remove that lactose and break it apart. Let's go back through the video and cover everything we talked about in the summary. We first defined what lactose was. We learned that lactose is a sugar that's composed of glucose and galactose. It is a disaccharide. Present in dairy, it's also used in pharmaceuticals to form tablets for drugs. Then we learned what lactose intolerance is. You know, most of us know it's because we can't process lactose, but we have a lactase deficiency. And that means that this enzyme that normally cuts lactose in two doesn't do that. So you have a buildup of lactose in your small intestine. And this small intestine has this brush border where lactase is present, but because lactase isn't as present, the lactose doesn't get processed. Then we learned about how the small intestine has these brush borders on them. The small intestine is a place where these nutrients are absorbed. In this case, the lactose is not broken down by the lactase and it builds up in your GI system, specifically your small intestine and your large intestine. We learned the different types of lactase deficiencies: primary, secondary, congenital, developmental. We learned that primary is the most common type of lactase deficiency, and they all have different causes and reasons. All of them tell us that lactase isn't common in that brush border. We learned about the signs and symptoms. When lactose isn't processed, fluid is built up, causing diarrhea. The bacteria ferments the lactose, causing gas. All this contributes to stomach pain, cramping, nausea, bloating, all the terrible symptoms that you experience when you consume dairy. And lastly, we learned about lactose-free products like Lactaid that has lactase. You'll end up with a slightly sweeter product, and if you consume the tablets, you're usually supposed to consume them when you consume dairy to help your body process that sugar. So that's all I got. I hope you guys learned a lot. I hope those of you who are lactose intolerant at least learned one new thing about why your GI system hates you when you consume lactose without the help of some lactase. As always, thank you so much for watching and listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell your friends, and I'll be back soon with another video.